"You're not trained!" The shout cuts through the chaos like a whip crack, raw, desperate, and loud enough to make the nearby soldiers freeze mid-motion. Sergeant Dana Ellis is on her knees, dirt streaked across her fatigues, eyes wide and wild as she stares at the old man kneeling beside her patient. The training exercise had turned real in seconds. What was supposed to be a staged rescue had become a battlefield. The scaffolding collapse had crushed one of her medics, and blood was pooling fast beneath his thigh, bright, arterial, unstoppable. But the stranger kneeling beside him didn't belong here. No uniform, no credentials, just calloused hands, rolled up sleeves, and the unhurried calm of someone who had seen this before, too many times. "I said step away." Ellis's voice breaks as she snatches for her kit, fumbling a suction tube that falls uselessly into the gravel. "You're going to make it worse!" The old man doesn't answer. He tightens a torn strip of fabric above the wound, fingers working with surgical precision. His breathing is steady, measured. He doesn't even look up. Ellis lunges forward, shoving his shoulder. "I'm serious! Get back! Now!" Finally, he looks at her. His voice is low, controlled, almost gentle, the kind of tone that somehow makes every word cut deeper. "Ma'am," he says, gripping the artery with one hand, reaching for a scalpel with the other. "He's got maybe 90 seconds. You can either yell, or you can hand me that clamp." She hesitates, staring at him, at those steady hands, those eyes that don't blink. Her mouth moves before her pride can stop it. "Who even are you?" He doesn't answer. The sound of sirens wails faintly in the distance, still too far away to help. The soldier on the ground gurgles, gasping for breath. The old man glances toward the wound, then back to her, eyes sharp as glass. "You want to save him?" His voice drops to a whisper. "Then stop watching." He takes the scalpel. Her next words come out like a plea. "You're going to kill him." And that's when he says it, the line that silences everything. "Worse," he murmurs, not looking up. "You're going to watch him die." The air holds its breath. Every sound, the wind, the shouting, the distant sirens, seems to pause for just a moment, as if the world itself were waiting to see what happens next. Behind the caution tape, recruits exchange looks. Someone whispers, "Who is that guy?" And from a distance, standing in the shadow of the command tent, a man in uniform watches quietly, recognition flickering in his eyes. But someone else had seen him before. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The morning hadn't started with blood. It had started with dew, the kind that clung stubbornly to blades of grass and soaked through the bottom hem of a man's pants before the sun even knew it was morning. John Albrecht moved through it anyway. 82 years old and built like a rusted-out tank, dented, slow to start, but impossible to kill. His gait was stiff but rhythmic, like his bones still followed the cadence of boots on foreign soil. The leather of his walking shoes squeaked faintly with each step, dampened by the weight of October air. He took the same path every Tuesday, around the park, past the maintenance shed with the crooked gutter, across the small footbridge that creaked like it might surrender but never did. He always nodded once at the flagpole by the playground, not out of habit, but out of memory. His hand twitched slightly near his hip, where muscle once instinctively moved to salute. Now it stayed by his side, fingers curling around the worn strap of a green duffel bag that had seen more miles than most men ever would. Inside that bag wasn't much: a stethoscope older than the recruits that jogged past him, a pair of medical shears dulled by time and friction, gauze, tape, a bottle of antiseptic that should have expired 5 years ago, but still smelled like war. No one asked why he carried it. Fewer still asked who he was. Around here, he was just Doc, the old guy with the limp, the one who didn't talk much but always had a knife sharpener in his back pocket. Some assumed he was homeless. Others assumed he was crazy. The truth didn't ask for attention. It just waited. On this particular Tuesday, the path took him past the north field of the base, a training day. He could tell from the plastic mannequins lined in rows, arms twisted unnaturally, eyes wide in simulated agony. Recruits moved between them like ants in disarray, lifting stretchers, shouting commands that barely matched the chaos they tried to tame. It was a controlled storm, manufactured urgency for the sake of preparedness. Albrecht slowed, not to watch, but to listen. He could hear the difference. Controlled chaos had rhythm. Real chaos didn't. Somewhere behind the third tent, something cracked. Deep, metal, final. It wasn't part of the script. Albrecht's shoulders tensed, body reacting faster than his age should have allowed. The ground didn't shake, but the air changed. Recruits looked toward the sound like children, unsure if thunder was part of the game. Then came the shouts. Not drills, not instruction. Fear, uncoached, unrehearsed fear. Albrecht moved. Not fast, but deliberate. He followed the sound, past a row of gawking trainees, past a folding table where radios spat static, past a soldier on the edge of throwing up. He saw the wreckage first. Scaffolding meant for practice extraction drills, now collapsed in a tangled heap. And under it, a real man. Not a dummy, not a test subject. A real soldier, face pale, leg crushed, blood pumping in hard, steady bursts that screamed of arterial damage. The medics were too young. He could see it in the way their hands hovered instead of pressed, the way their voices rose instead of dropped. Panic doesn't always look like running. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. He knelt without invitation, because permission hadn't saved anyone in his memory. His knees cracked, his back screamed, but his hands remembered. Across the gravel, Sergeant Dana Ellis had just made it to the scene. She barked orders as if the volume might organize the fear. She saw Albrecht, and her face twisted in confusion. Then rage, then something close to terror. He didn't hear her first shout. The blood was too loud, but he felt the tension coil in the air like a spring being loaded. That moment, that brief flicker before her scream, was the last second anyone still believed this was a training accident. His name wasn't spoken aloud in that moment. No one looked at him and saw medals, deployments, or years of battlefield medicine that made modern kits look like toys. They saw a stranger, an old man with weathered skin and eyes that didn't match the situation. But the situation was lying to them. Albrecht didn't panic, because his brain still sorted bodies by triage category before his mouth could form a sentence. He clamped the belt around the soldier's thigh. The angle was wrong, but he adjusted with the instinct of someone who'd once done this under mortar fire. The belt held. The bleeding slowed. A few voices behind him stopped shouting. He didn't notice. His focus was the breath, the chest movement, the pale color of the lips. Things you didn't need machines to measure. You just needed time. And time was not being generous today. Ellis's shout finally hit him, not the words, the tone. And it was enough to pull him from the tunnel. He turned, calmly, and met her fear with stillness. Not because he wanted to prove something, but because he had nothing left to prove. She wasn't wrong to be afraid. She was just afraid of the wrong thing. He didn't give her his name. She wouldn't have believed it. Not yet. Instead, he gave her facts. Cold, sharp, inescapable. How long the soldier had. What would happen next. What she could do if she still wanted to be useful. Her pride burned behind her eyes, but her hands trembled too much to argue. She didn't stop him. Not really. The words kept coming, but her feet didn't move. Behind them, others had started to gather. Some took out phones, others simply stared. A few whispered. The man on the ground had a name too, but no one remembered it. Not in that moment. All anyone could see was the blood, the stranger in the gray shirt, and the scalpel that seemed to appear in his hand like it belonged there. Albrecht took the blade and turned back to the wound. His knees ached, his shoulders protested, but his fingers never shook. The duffel bag beside him had been packed for 30 years with the same contents, give or take. Not for emergencies, not for attention, just in case. Because once, long ago, a young man with shaking hands had needed something sharp, something clean, and something to stop the bleeding. And no one had it. Not until it was too late. Ellis didn't know any of that. She only knew she was watching a man commit field surgery with gravel under his knees and resolve in his eyes. Somewhere behind her, another officer reached for his radio. But the static was still louder than the signal, and help was still too far. And somewhere, beyond the crowd, beyond the smoke, a figure stood in a pressed jacket, watching from under the shade of the command tent. His hand hovered near his chest, eyes narrowed. Recognition started like a memory, and it was beginning to return. It wasn't the first time they'd seen him. Not really. He had passed through their peripheral vision for months, maybe years. Just another old man near the base perimeter, minding his own business, too stubborn to stay indoors and too quiet to be noticed. They had walked by him during warm-ups, chuckled at the beat-up duffel bag slung over his shoulder, shared side-eyes at his weathered boots, and that ever-present half-limp that seemed more muscle memory than injury. None of them ever asked his name. He was just that guy, the one who didn't know when to quit. John Albrecht didn't expect anyone to know him. He had stopped expecting that a long time ago, but he noticed them. Every glance, every whisper, every look exchanged between young soldiers who hadn't seen what real war did to a man's soul. He didn't take offense. Offense was for the soft parts of life, the ones you got to keep when you weren't carrying the memories he carried. Most days he didn't even hear the insults anymore. They drifted over him like wind through pine needles, acknowledged only by the oldest trees, the ones still standing long after the fire had passed. He always stopped at the same place after his walk, a bench at the edge of the lot, near the back of the motor pool. From there he could see the field, the barracks beyond, and the flagpole that still rose with ceremony every morning at 6. He never saluted. Not anymore. That was for those who still wore the uniform. But he never looked away, either. Not once. Beside the bench sat his truck, a 1984 Chevy Silverado that looked like it had been pulled out of a mudslide and never forgiven for it. The paint was sun-faded, the mirrors were mismatched, and the back seat was crammed with old manuals, bungee cords, and a fire extinguisher that probably didn't meet modern regulations. But in the bed sat the green duffel, always in reach, always ready, just in case. He opened the driver's side door with a grunt, shoulders resisting every inch, and pulled out a small thermos and a metal lunch tin. Inside, a bologna sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a few carrots, and a hard-boiled egg. Not a feast, but it was food. He sat on the tailgate and watched the recruits begin the second half of their training session. Simulated extraction under fire. He shook his head slightly. Too clean. Too loud. Too much theory. From the corner of his eye, he saw 2 young soldiers whispering as they jogged past. The shorter one pointed. The taller one smirked. "There goes Grandpa Band-Aid," the tall one muttered, not quiet enough. Albrecht didn't move, didn't speak, just unscrewed the thermos lid and took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee. "Still thinks it's Nam out here," the shorter one added, grinning like the joke was original. He'd heard them all before. Grandpa Band-Aid, the ghost medic, the field fossil. None of it mattered. They could joke all they wanted, and they would, until something went wrong, until it wasn't foam dummies and plastic wounds, until they saw real blood. Then they'd stop laughing. Everyone did. A corporal leaned against the fence nearby, arms crossed, pretending not to notice. His eyes flicked toward Albrecht, then away. He looked like he wanted to say something. Maybe an apology, maybe not. But he said nothing. That was the way of things now. A generation raised to speak in silence, afraid their words might betray how little they actually knew. Albrecht finished his sandwich and wiped his fingers on a napkin he folded into a square with almost ceremonial precision. Not out of obsession, out of habit. The kind of habit that stayed with a man who'd once had to sterilize tools with whiskey and hope the patient didn't scream loud enough to give away their position. The ground beneath his boots was cracked, sun-dried, uneven. He tapped it once with the heel of his foot, testing something, remembering something. His eyes lingered on a patch of dirt beside the fence, a place where, years ago, a trainee had collapsed from heat stroke during a summer drill. Albrecht had been there too, but no one had recorded that one. No one had yelled then either. They had just watched. Just like today. The wind picked up and carried a thin scent of oil and dust from the motor pool. It mingled with the metallic edge of sweat and sunburned plastic from the training field. To most, it was unpleasant. To Albrecht, it smelled like home, or at least what home had become after the wars. You never really came back, not all of you. Some parts stayed behind, in the jungle, in the desert, in the dirt under someone else's boots. He packed away the remains of his lunch and stood slowly, one hand pressing against the truck bed for leverage. His knees groaned, his spine protested, but his hands once again stayed steady. He walked across the lot toward the bleachers where recruits were now being debriefed. Their instructor barked questions with performative volume, but few listened. Most were sneaking glances at their phones, at the footage, at him. It had started spreading already. The clip, blurry, shaky, but unmistakable. A gray-shirted man kneeling in the dirt, cutting into flesh with calm hands, while a soldier bled out beneath him. The old guy who didn't belong there. The one no one had stopped. Some were calling it recklessness, others were calling it a miracle. But not one of them had stood up when it was happening. The instructor paused mid-sentence, distracted by murmurs. He turned, looked toward the lot, then toward Albrecht, who had paused by the fence again. Their eyes met. There was no recognition in the younger man's face, just confusion. A civilian on a military base, breaking rules he didn't even know existed. No one moved to confront him. Not this time. Behind him, 2 medics walked by, whispering again. Not laughing now, just whispering. One of them carried a clipboard that trembled slightly in his grip. And in the command tent, a name was finally spoken aloud. A name that hadn't been uttered in over 2 decades on this base. John Albrecht. And someone remembered. The air changed before the sound did. It thickened, like humidity before a thunderstorm, but drier, heavier, almost metallic. Albrecht had felt that shift before. It happened seconds before artillery hit the perimeter, or right before a helicopter lost altitude. A stillness, then a silence, then everything exploded. This time, it was scaffolding. The metal structure used in the drill wavered, a moment of imbalance unnoticed by all but the wind. It buckled with a groan that went unheard beneath the noise of instruction, laughter, and boots in motion. Then came the crash. Not cinematic, not dramatic, just raw industrial violence. Bolts sheared, joints collapsed, steel struck gravel and bone. There was no warning, no shouted command, just a scream, not one of fear, one of pain. Sharp, immediate, real. Recruits scattered like startled birds, instinct overriding training. Some dropped to a knee, others froze in place, but a few moved closer, only to be halted by the sight of blood. Thick, dark, pulsing from beneath the twisted weight of a support beam. It soaked through the soldiers' fatigues within seconds. A pant leg turned crimson. A hand twitched, then stilled. A young trainee gagged and turned away. Another cursed under his breath, pulling out a radio that spat back nothing but static. The base frequency was down. Murphy's Law had arrived early. Ellis reached the scene with a sprint, the kind born not of fitness but of panic. Her boots scraped the gravel as she dropped beside the fallen soldier, yanking off her gloves, fingers trembling before they even made contact. She shouted orders. No one responded. She looked back. Recruits stood like statues, watching, waiting. None moved. Albrecht was already moving, not running, not rushing, just moving. He had seen the blood before they had heard the difference between fake distress and the sound of real air leaving real lungs. His body obeyed a rhythm long since ingrained. The path to the wounded was always straight, always direct, and always came with risk. He knelt beside the injured man, too young, too pale, too still, and slipped a gloved hand beneath the leg. The blood was arterial, bright, pulsing, with a rhythm of its own, the kind of bleed that counted seconds, not minutes. No time for calls, no time for permission. He unzipped the duffel without looking. The tools inside had been packed the same way since 1972. He didn't hesitate. Tourniquet first, pressure second, tension third. Then came the voice. "You're not cleared for this. Step away. Now!" It was Ellis. She was across from him now, face flushed, voice trembling between command and pleading. Her hand hovered near her belt. Instinct, not authority. She looked at him not with recognition, but alarm, as if his very presence was a threat to protocol. "You're not supposed to be here!" Albrecht didn't respond. He adjusted the pressure, shifted his knee, checked the soldier's breathing. One nostril flared. The eye twitched. Good. Still alive. "You can't just start cutting into someone," she shouted again, louder this time. Eyes were on her now, and that mattered more than anything. A leader who couldn't control the scene would lose it, and she was losing it. He finally spoke, not with volume, but with gravity. "You've got 3 minutes to stop this bleed, or he loses the leg. 2, and he loses his life." Her mouth opened, but no words came. Her eyes darted to the others, the bystanders, the audience, some holding phones now, recording, immortalizing, judging. "I said step away!" The shout cracked through the air like a rifle shot, and that was when the silence truly began. Not absence of sound, but the vacuum that forms when something irreversible is said in front of too many people. Albrecht didn't move. He didn't flinch. He reached for the scalpel, not quickly, not dramatically, just like it was the next step, because it was. The young soldier beside her, a private, barely 20, stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Ma'am, maybe he—" "Stand down!" she snapped, not even looking at him. The private hesitated, then stepped back, eyes flicking toward Albrecht with something close to apology. No one else intervened, not the recruits, not the medics, not the instructors. Everyone held their breath, not out of fear, but out of cowardice. Because to act meant to choose, and they weren't ready to choose between rank and experience, youth and instinct, order and urgency. Albrecht sliced the pant leg open, revealing the wound. It was worse than expected. The artery was nearly severed, bone exposed, tissue shredded, but it wasn't hopeless, not yet. He removed a pen from his pocket, uncapped it, broke it into 2 halves, and inserted one piece near the wound as a makeshift drain. The other half went into his mouth, clenched between his teeth as he adjusted the clamp with both hands. Ellis stood frozen. Her authority was paper, her voice irrelevant. She knew it, and in that moment, the weight of it crushed her pride into something sharp and ugly. "You're going to kill him!" she shouted again, but it landed hollow now, like someone yelling fire in a room already burning. And that's when he looked at her. Finally, directly. His voice was soft, not a threat, not a retort, just truth. "Worse," he said, eyes locked to hers. "You're going to watch him die." The phrase struck deeper than any shout. It sliced through her anger, her confusion, her need to be right. Behind her, someone muttered something, but it didn't register. The soldier on the ground convulsed once, then went still. The wind shifted, and the eyes watching from the command tent narrowed. The sound of panic had a texture. It wasn't just loud. It crackled, like wires being stretched to their limit before they snapped. But amid that static chaos, there was one movement untouched by the noise. John Albrecht's hands. They moved like they remembered what to do before the brain had time to catch up. Like instinct, sharpened by memory and dulled by nothing. Not age, not fear, not even the weight of the eyes around him. He didn't speak again. He had said all that needed saying. The soldier's pulse had weakened. The bleeding had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. A decision had to be made. One no one else was ready to make. the kind that etched itself into a man's skin long after the scar was gone. He reached into the kit and removed a pair of curved clamps, not the sterile, fresh-from-package kind. These had been cleaned by hand, maintained by necessity, carried in silence. With precision only time could teach, he pinched the artery between 2 points and tested the seal. The blood stuttered, then ceased its rhythm. It wasn't victory, it was just delay. But sometimes delay was all a soldier needed to stay alive long enough to fight another day. He reached for gauze, packed it gently around the wound, adjusted the angle of the leg slightly to elevate the sight, and slid a piece of reinforced plastic beneath the thigh for support. His fingers pressed the fabric firmly. No trembling, no wasted motion. Even the dust beneath his knees seemed to settle out of respect. Across from him, Ellis was silent now. Her hands still hovered, but not in protest. In hesitation, her face was pale, not from fear, but from realization. She wasn't in control. She never had been. The protocols had felt strong until reality punched through them. Now they crumbled like old paper. The recruits stood frozen, eyes flicking between her and Albrecht. They hadn't seen this in training. No one had. They had read about hemorrhaging, practiced with dummy wounds, but they hadn't seen someone cut into a man's thigh with the calm of someone buttering toast. A gust of wind blew through the yard, lifting the corner of a field top and sending dust into the air. It passed over Albrecht, catching in his silver hair, tugging gently at the collar of his faded gray shirt. He blinked once, then reached for a small bottle of antiseptic and poured it onto a strip of cloth. The fluid sizzled slightly as it met the exposed tissue. The soldier didn't stir. His face was still, but the color was no longer draining. There was still time. Barely. One of the younger medics leaned in slightly, curiosity overtaking shock. His mouth opened, but no question came out. He watched as Albrecht secured the final piece of dressing with medical tape, tearing the end cleanly with his teeth. Then he reached into the duffel again, not for a tool, but for a worn scrap of cloth, a bandana, folded precisely into a square. He pressed it into the soldier's hand and curled the fingers around it. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured, just loud enough to cross the space between flesh and breath. No theatrics, no heroism, just a task, just the job no one else was ready for. A few feet away, Ellis knelt slowly, her knees finding the ground more from defeat than choice. Her eyes had lost their fire, replaced now by something more dangerous, doubt. She stared at her own hands as if she didn't recognize them, tools that had been trained but not tested. The soldier who had tried to intervene earlier, the private with the hesitant voice, took a single step forward and crouched beside her. He didn't speak either, but his body leaned slightly toward Albrecht, like a compass finally finding north. Behind them, two instructors murmured quietly into their radios. The connection was patchy, but word had begun to spread, not just about the accident, but about him. The old man in civilian clothes conducting field surgery like he still wore the badge, the stripes, the burden. Albrecht sat back on his heels. He didn't stand yet. His breathing had grown heavier, not from stress, but from age. The kind of fatigue that comes not from effort, but from history. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, stained with blood that wasn't his. The wind moved again, and this time it carried something else. Attention. From the edge of the crowd, a low voice finally spoke. Where the hell did he learn that? No one answered, but the silence felt like agreement. Another medic, older than the rest, whispered without looking away. That's not YouTube stuff, that's war. Still, no one moved to thank him. No one applauded. That would have cheapened it. But a few hats were removed. A few eyes dropped to the ground. The kind of reverence that only comes after watching something sacred and unfamiliar. Across the field, beneath the awning of the command tent, a man had stopped drinking his coffee. The cup sat untouched on the table beside him. His arms were crossed, his eyes narrowed, watching, not in suspicion, but recognition. Colonel Marcus Bain didn't need to ask who the man was. He already knew. Colonel Marcus Bain hadn't planned to stay long. He wasn't supposed to be on base at all that day. Retirement, in theory, had freed him from responsibility, from routine, from the unspoken burdens of uniform and command. But some habits, like others who wore the cloth, refused to die quietly. He still arrived early, still checked rosters, still walked the perimeter when no one expected him to. And that morning, something had pulled him toward the training field. A quiet pull, nothing urgent, just something. He'd seen the drills before, the staged rescues, the barked commands, the sloppy falls and unconvincing simulations. He usually left after 10 minutes, irritated by the performance of preparedness. But today he stayed. Not because the training was better. It wasn't. But because of the old man. He'd spotted him from across the field. Not a man who wandered, a man who patrolled. There was something deliberate about the way he moved. Something that didn't match his age. Marcus had narrowed his eyes, watching through the slit of his sunglasses, curiosity nodding with unease. The face was familiar, the posture more so. It was the gait, though, that stiff, sure limp that cracked something loose in memory. Then the scaffolding collapsed. From his vantage point beneath the command tent, he saw the shift before anyone else heard it. The angle, the tension, the failure. When the beam fell, he was already moving, but he didn't run. He watched, waiting for someone to lead. No one did. What followed wasn't chaos. It was worse. It was hesitation. Everyone on that field had been trained. Everyone wore the right patches, carried the right gear, had shouted the right orders all morning, but none of them moved the way soldiers move when real life bleeds into the dirt. Except one. The old man didn't flinch. He was at the fallen soldier's side before the shouting even began. Bain saw it all. The way he dropped his bag, how his knees hit gravel without a grunt of pain, how his hands moved as if remembering rather than deciding. And just like that, the memories crashed back in. Hill 937, Ripcord, 1969, bodies coming faster than names. Blood slicked on hands too young to hold scalpels. A medic working by firelight, stitching skin with thread meant for boots. Shaking boys whispering prayers into the wind. And at the center of it all, a pair of hands that didn't shake. Bain hadn't said that name in 20 years. Not since the last reunion. Not since most of the men who could say it with understanding were laid beneath folded flags. But now he said it, under his breath, barely audible. Albrecht. The syllables felt heavy on his tongue. Not reverent, just real. He leaned forward, bracing both hands on the edge of the folding table. Around him, aides murmured, eyes darting to the commotion. Someone offered him a radio. He didn't take it. The scene was already happening. Orders would be too late. Albrecht didn't need orders. Bain watched the young sergeant, Ellis he remembered now, shout, flail, panic. He had liked her once. She had promise. But she hadn't seen enough yet. She thought command came from volume. That authority was louder than consequence. But authority meant nothing if you couldn't stop the bleeding. And that's what John Albrecht had always done. He stopped the bleeding. The younger medics watched, with the wide-eyed awe of men seeing something they hadn't been taught in manuals. Bain saw it settle into their bones. That understanding that some lessons are carved into flesh, not printed on paper. Ellis's voice cracked, her pride fraying like old rope. She didn't know who she was fighting. Not really. But Bain did. He straightened slowly, the ache in his spine not from age, but from the memories that lived there. He didn't call for security, didn't ask for a report. He just watched. And as he watched, the silence inside him turned to certainty. The field wasn't under control. It was under care. A lieutenant beside him cleared his throat. "Sir, should we intervene?" Bain didn't answer. He let the moment hang, let the question unravel in its own foolishness. The lieutenant tried again. "That man, he's not authorized." Bain's voice cut across the tent like a blade dragged across cloth. "He's doing what you couldn't." The words silenced the tent. No one responded. They didn't need to. Outside, Albrecht had finished securing the field dressing. The boy was still alive, pale, but breathing. Ellis knelt in silence, and the old man with the silver hair and the bloodied gloves sat back, calm as a thunderstorm after it's passed. Bain stepped out from the shade. The sun hit his chest like a reminder. It was hot, the kind of heat that pulled sweat from the skin of your neck and forced you to blink more often than usual. He didn't wipe his brow. He didn't button his collar. He just walked, slowly, deliberately, toward the man who had saved 19 boys with a helmet and a roll of duct tape. He hadn't planned to intervene, but then the name clicked. John Albrecht rose slowly from the dirt. His knees cracked like dry twigs. His spine straightened one vertebra at a time, and the blood on his hands had begun to dry into the creases of his knuckles. He didn't stretch. He didn't sigh. He just stood there, steady as the sky. The soldier he had operated on was still unconscious, wrapped in makeshift gauze and old knowledge. His breathing was shallow but present. That was enough, for now. Around him, the field remained still. Not silent. There was always noise on a military base, but hushed in the way that made people listen harder. The sound of wind against canvas. The distant thump of boots trying not to run. The static from a radio still trying to find a signal. A dog barking far off, unanswered. Albrecht's eyes swept the scene once, not to take it in but to confirm. Triage was done. Wound stabilized. Tourniquet holding. Airway clear. And the rest of the injuries were minimal. Scrapes, bruises, shock. What he'd seen on 100 fields, on 100 different days, wearing 100 different names. The only thing that ever changed was the faces. Then Ellis stepped forward. Her boots crunched on the gravel like she was walking over glass. Her expression was torn. Rage, shame, pride, something bitter and shapeless forming behind her eyes. She held her chin high, but her voice trembled at the edges, brittle as frost. You could have killed him." She didn't shout it this time. It came out like a statement someone told her to make. She knew it lacked teeth the second it left her mouth. Albrecht looked at her without expression. He didn't blink, didn't move, just waited until the silence after her sentence had settled, and then said what he'd been thinking since the moment she tried to stop him. "You have procedures," he said. His voice was quiet but carried. "I had seconds." The words landed like a slow punch, not meant to wound, but to break something open. Ellis flinched, but not visibly. It was in the eyes, the way her gaze dropped for half a second before she forced it back up again. She opened her mouth, but another voice interrupted before she could reply. "Sergeant." The tone was firm, low, not loud, but unmistakable. She turned sharply, instinctively straightening. Colonel Marcus Bain stood 10 feet away. He wasn't in full dress, but the presence was the same. His jacket was civilian, but the bearing was military, carved into him by years of command and loss. His hands were behind his back, his stance solid, his jaw clenched. "Do you know who that is?" he asked. The question wasn't rhetorical. Ellis faltered. "No, sir." Bain took a step closer, not toward her but toward Albrecht. His eyes never left the old man. There was something in them that hadn't been there in years. Recognition, respect, and something like guilt. "He's the reason I'm standing here," Bain said, softly now. "The reason 2 of my brothers made it home in '69. The reason a dozen others weren't zipped into bags and forgotten." The words didn't silence the field. They deepened it, like someone had just closed the door on an argument and left only consequence behind. Albrecht said nothing. His hands hung loosely by his sides. The wind tugged gently at his shirt sleeve, revealing a sliver of faded ink on his forearm, a unit number nearly washed away by time. Bain turned to the surrounding soldiers, his voice gaining steel. "This man's name is John Albrecht, United States Navy Corpsman, Firebase Ripcord, Hill 937. He held a line with nothing but gauze, grit, and God's mercy while mortars fell like hail and half the unit bled out in the dirt." A medic near the back swallowed audibly. Another lowered his phone. Bain didn't stop. He sewed up 19 men in one night with a boot needle and adrenaline. No morphine, no backup, just his bare hands and a helmet full of makeshift instruments. Ellis looked at Albrecht again, but this time, like she was seeing him for the first time. The old man, the quiet presence on the edge of the field, the ghost in civilian clothes. He was never cleared for any of it, Bain added, but we'd have all died if he waited for clearance. The words settled like dust after a firefight. Slow, final, undeniable. Ellis opened her mouth again, but there was nothing left to say. The private who had tried to speak earlier took a slow step forward. He bent down and picked up Albrecht's green duffel, holding it with both hands, carefully, like it was sacred. He walked up to him, held it out. "Sir," just one word, but in that moment, it was everything. Albrecht nodded once, took the bag. His eyes flicked briefly toward Ellis. Not with triumph, not with disdain, just recognition. A soldier once, like so many he had seen, too young, too proud, too afraid to admit what they didn't know. Then Bain spoke again, not to Albrecht, not to Ellis, but to all of them. "This," he said, motioning to the soldier on the ground, "was a life saved by a man we forgot. And for the first time since the collapse, no one moved. Not a boot shifted, not a whisper passed. The field stood still, held in the gravity of what had just happened. The respect wasn't shouted, it wasn't saluted, it was felt. And the diner in their hearts went quiet. The field had not returned to normal. It wouldn't, not for a long time. The kind of stillness that followed wasn't relief. It was recalibration, the kind of pause when people stop pretending they understand what they've just seen and begin trying to feel it instead. And at the center of it stood a man who had said barely a handful of words, but whose silence spoke volumes. John Albrecht didn't stand in triumph. He stood like a statue finally remembered after years of gathering moss. Colonel Bain took another step forward and stopped just short of reaching him. Their eyes met, finally, fully. No salute passed between them, no handshake. That would have been too theatrical, too soft for what lived in the space between them. They had seen too many things for ceremony to carry weight. What they gave instead was eye contact held just long enough to break through time itself. Bain's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes softened. He looked, not at the man standing before him now, but at the one from 5 decades earlier. Mud on his knees, blood on his forearms. A field dressing clenched between his teeth as he tried to save another boy who would never see 21. He saw the young Albrecht in flashes, the same posture, the same hands, the same unshakable calm. The years had aged the vessel, but the core remained untouched. Albrecht blinked once. A small nod followed. It wasn't approval. It wasn't gratitude. It was something older than both. Recognition, not of authority, not of rank, but of brotherhood. Bain felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a memory finally finding a place to rest. There were some men you saluted. There were others you remembered to salute too late. Behind them, the recruits stood at varying distances, most still frozen, caught between guilt and awe. The weight of their earlier jokes now hung in their throats like barbed wire. The silence grew not from discipline, but from respect, the involuntary kind. The kind that doesn't need to be taught. It's earned the moment a boy sees a man do something no manual can teach. Ellis had not moved. Her shoulders had lowered slightly, the stiffness gone from her arms. Her eyes now fixed on Albrecht not with defiance or embarrassment, but with the terrible clarity that comes from understanding. She had judged him. She had doubted him. And now she had watched him pull a soldier back from death using a belt, a pen cap, and memory. That kind of understanding did not come with punishment. It came with weight. She stepped back once, instinctively making space. Not out of fear, out of reverence. She didn't look at Bain. She didn't look at the crowd. Her focus stayed on Albrecht. And as their eyes met for the second time that day, the air between them shifted. The battlefield inside her quieted. Albrecht didn't scold her, didn't correct her. That would have been easy. Instead, He simply acknowledged her presence as one soldier does another. She hadn't failed. She had learned. The hard way. The only way that ever sticks. The injured soldier on the ground stirred, barely, a twitch of the fingers. A groan that barely escaped cracked lips. One of the medics knelt quickly, checking vitals. The bandage held. Blood pressure stabilizing. He was still with them. The private who had earlier held Albrecht's bag stepped forward again. Not to speak, but to stand near him. Not at his side, just behind, slightly offset. The subtle position of someone choosing alignment without needing permission. Another medic moved toward the group slowly, his eyes low, expression unreadable. He held something in his hand, a roll of tape, unused, from the kit that had been dropped when the panic began. He extended it to Albrecht without a word, palm up, eyes steady. Albrecht took it. Then, something almost imperceptible happened. Albrecht's gaze swept the perimeter of the field and landed on the reflective glass of the nearby operations trailer. There, in the mirror-like sheen, he saw his own silhouette standing beside Bain's. Two figures, one uniformed, one not, but equal in stillness. And in that quiet reflection, a flicker of something passed between them. History, grief, pride, all condensed into one unspoken thing that no one else would ever understand. That was enough. He turned to walk, not away, just to step aside, to let the others do what they had frozen from doing earlier. The younger medics now began to move in, careful, deliberate, rechecking vitals, calling for a stretcher, performing the work, but with new hands, humbled hands. Albrecht moved slowly toward his duffel, which now rested in the dirt beside his feet. He knelt, one knee at a time, slower now, and began repacking his tools with the same methodical calm he had unpacked them with. He wiped the scalpel clean, rewrapped the gauze, folded the torn bandana, and placed it in the side pocket. Nothing rushed, nothing forgotten. A medic approached from behind. She didn't speak. She placed a canteen on the ground next to him, water cool from the field chest. Albrecht nodded once, accepting the gesture the way a soldier does. No words, just acknowledgement. Colonel Bain stood a few feet behind him, arms crossed now, watching not the field, but the man. Watching the space around him change. Watching how presence rewrites protocol when respect walks in uninvited. And then, after a long silence, Bain asked a question. Not loudly, not for show. Just a question only a real corpsman would recognize. What did it smell like? After ripcord fell? Albrecht paused in his packing. His hand rested on the duffel. His fingers curled slightly, as if squeezing a memory too tightly held for too long. His voice, when it came, was gravel wrapped in dust. Wet steel, cordite, steam rising off the dead. The wind moved again, and no one spoke after that. The question lingered in the air long after it was spoken. It didn't need a response to be heard. Some questions were like wounds, unseen but still bleeding. Colonel Bain hadn't asked it for the others. He hadn't asked it for formality. He'd asked it because it had haunted him for over 50 years. The smell, the steam, the knowing that survival came not from bravery, but from a man with a medical bag and no choice. John Albrecht didn't turn around. He didn't need to. His eyes stared into the dirt, but what he saw was not gravel or boots. It was a jungle hill, the kind that swallowed sound, where green turned red and time collapsed into minutes, stretched like years. His hands remained still, resting on the folded flap of the duffel. No more tools were needed now, just the truth. Behind him, the younger soldiers had gone quiet again, not frozen this time, listening. Every breath on that field belonged to someone waiting for something they didn't understand. The past was no longer a distant thing. It had stepped into the circle with them, and now it was speaking. Bain took a slow step closer, not to close the distance, but to stand shoulder to shoulder, not beside the man, but beside the memory. His voice was quieter now, stripped of command. They said you didn't sleep for 3 days. Albrecht nodded slowly. Wasn't time. They said you kept sewing through a concussion. Albrecht's jaw flexed slightly. Didn't know I had one. They said you used a bayonet to amputate a leg because there wasn't time for morphine. A pause. Then, he lived. The words didn't boast. They confessed. The soldiers listening didn't know what Firebase Ripcord was. Not really. Not beyond a name in a dusty chapter of a book none of them finished reading. But the way Bain spoke, the way Albrecht answered, it filled in the blanks. It made the past too real to ignore. Bain shifted slightly, folding his arms behind his back. His tone lost its edge, gained a crack. They also said you never got a commendation, that you refused it. Albrecht finally looked up. His eyes met Bain's with quiet certainty. Didn't need a medal. Needed the boys to make it home. The silence after that was absolute. A crow called in the distance. Gravel shifted under someone's boot. But no one dared break the moment. Ellis, standing further back now, lowered her eyes. She'd spent her whole career chasing protocols, chasing recognition, chasing the illusion that preparation equaled readiness. But in 1 hour, everything she believed about order had crumbled beneath the weight of one man's lived experience. The private near her, no longer grinning, no longer smirking, glanced sideways at his friends. No more jokes. Not today. His expression held something between shame and reverence. He had called the man Grandpa Band-Aid less than an hour ago. Now he couldn't even meet his eyes. Bain looked out across the field, not at the drills, not at the structures, but at the people, the medics, the instructors, the curious eyes still watching from beyond the tape. He raised his voice slightly, not for ceremony, but for clarity. This man isn't just a veteran. He is the reason men like me came home to families instead of flag-draped caskets. You all owe your training to people like him, even if the manuals forgot to mention it. Albrecht said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, and now it belonged to everyone who had heard it. The injured soldier on the ground shifted again. This time, his lips parted slightly. A whisper escaped. No one caught it clearly, but it was something. A fragment of consciousness. A flicker of life sustained by hands steady in the storm. Bain turned back to Albrecht, his expression softening further. "Why'd you come back?" he asked. "To the base." "After all these years?" Albrecht looked down at his hands. The blood, the calluses, the quiet. He didn't smile, but something in his voice carried the weight of 100 Tuesdays. "Couldn't stop carrying the bag," he said. "Figured one day, someone might need it." Bain nodded. No further questions. The medics began packing up the scene. The stretcher team approached, careful, respectful. They moved around Albrecht with wide steps, as if stepping near sacred ground. No one directed them. No one needed to. The sun had begun its slow descent. Shadows lengthened across the gravel. The air cooled slightly, brushing against cheeks like a breath from a different era. And then the recruits began to move, not toward the wounded, not toward the gear, but toward Albrecht. One by one they approached, not for selfies, not for words, but for presence. Some stood near him in silence. Others simply nodded. One held out his hand, and Albrecht shook it. Firm, steady, brief. No one said thank you. They didn't have to. They had heard the story, and that was enough. The stretcher lifted slowly, guided by two medics who now moved with the measured grace of men who had learned something that wouldn't fit in a textbook. The soldier's face, though still pale, had color returning in faint blotches across his cheekbones. His fingers, once limp, now curled slightly around the fabric of his field blanket. No one rushed the evacuation. There was no siren, no chaos, only quiet urgency and reverence, the kind earned in blood. John Albrecht stood a few paces away, his duffel once again slung over his shoulder. The weight of it wasn't just in the supplies, it was the history stitched into every zipper, every faded strap. He didn't expect anything more. His role had always been temporary. Triage, repair, retreat. That was the rhythm. That was the rule. But the rule broke when the commanding officer of the base walked into the middle of the field and said a single name. Albrecht. The entire training yard paused. Conversations cut short. Radios clicked silent. Even the birds seemed to hush, as if drawn into formation. Colonel Bain didn't speak with authority. He spoke with intention. Slow, clear, deliberate. A man who knew the weight of his own voice and when to use it. This man stood in the fire before most of you were born. He held bleeding boys in his arms while gunfire lit the night sky. And today, he reminded all of us what it means to act, not wait. He turned to Albrecht directly now. No podium, no script, just truth. We spend our lives teaching rules, protocol, systems of command, but none of those ever saved lives by themselves. Men did. Men like you. The field did not erupt. There was no applause. That would have cheapened it. Instead, there was a shifting of weight, as if the base itself had exhaled and reset its posture. Recognition lived in the nods, in the way soldiers began to square their shoulders, in the way instructors removed their hats without being asked. Bain looked over his shoulder and gave a simple order to the operations chief, who stood stiffly behind him, unsure if this was rehearsed. From this day forward, any veteran on base during medical drills is to be considered active emergency support. Their presence is not optional, it is essential. If someone like John Albrecht says act, you act. No objections came, no questions. Just a few recruits nodding slowly, the kind of nod that marks the start of a change they don't yet fully understand. But trust. Ellis stood near the back of the group. She didn't shrink. She didn't leave. She stepped forward. A single pace, not toward the center, but toward Albrecht. Her voice was softer than before, no longer shaky, no longer defensive. "I'm sorry, sir. I wasn't ready." He turned, the weight of his gaze settling on her. There was no judgment in it, only memory. "Neither was I," he said. "First time I had to cut a man open, he called me Mom. I was 20. A few of the younger medics glanced around, unsure if they were allowed to laugh, but Albrecht wasn't joking, and that made it land harder. Ellis lowered her head slightly, then raised it again. "If you're willing, I'd like to learn." He gave her a long look, then nodded. "You carry your kid every day?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Start by carrying your doubt with it. Then let experience replace one." She didn't answer. She just stood a little taller. Behind them, the injured soldier was loaded into the ambulance. The engine rumbled softly to life. As it pulled away, the recruits turned to watch, not the vehicle, but the direction it was headed, toward survival, toward a second chance. Albrecht turned to leave, not with ceremony, just the way he always had, quiet, unnoticed by most. But this time, the crowd parted for him, not by order, instinctively, a natural formation of respect. As he passed through the line of soldiers, several stood at attention, not for protocol, for him. The same private who had once smirked and whispered now stood in place, chin raised, jaw tight. His eyes followed Albrecht until he passed, and then slowly, as if by impulse, he raised his hand and gave a clean, silent salute. Albrecht paused. Not fully, just long enough. He returned the salute. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was perfect. And from that moment forward, the field was different, not in appearance, not in structure, but in tone. Because the old man in the gray shirt had reminded them that honor wasn't written in manuals. It was carried in silence, and passed on in blood. The Tuesday after the collapse, the base was quieter than usual. Not from absence, but from attentiveness. The voices were softer. The drills began slower. There was no shouting for the sake of volume. The gravel beneath boots still crunched, the doors still slammed, but the tone had shifted. Respect had settled into the walls, invisible, but felt, like the smell of old gun oil or the creak of floorboards in a familiar barracks. Subtle, but permanent. At the edge of the training field, under the shade of a green canopy tent, John Albrecht sat alone on a folding chair. His duffel rested beside him, packed the same way it had always been. His boots, still worn and dusted with memory, tapped gently against the steel legs of the chair in slow rhythm. In his hand, a battered thermos, dented and scratched, bearing a faded sticker from decades ago. USN Corpsman, 1965. The letters were peeling, but still legible, still proud. No one had asked him to be there. No official schedule, no assigned position. And yet, a folding chair was already waiting for him when he arrived that morning, placed in the exact same spot he had stood when the soldier began bleeding out. Someone had thought ahead. Someone had understood. That was enough. Recruits passed by with slower steps now. Some nodded. Some paused. One or two offered a quiet, "Good morning, sir," without being told to. Albrecht nodded back, occasionally raising the thermos in silent salute. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and yet somehow, his presence spoke louder than most instructors ever could. Ellis approached mid-morning, not in uniform, not with authority, but with a backpack slung over her shoulder and a field manual tucked under one arm. She didn't ask permission. She simply sat down in the second folding chair that had appeared beside his sometime in the last 2 days. She didn't open the manual. She didn't speak right away. She just waited. After several long minutes, Albrecht looked over. "You bring your doubts?" he asked. She gave the faintest nod. "Good," he said. "They'll keep you honest." That was all. They sat like that for a while. 2 generations side by side. One steeped in experience, the other trying to earn it. Throughout the day, other medics came in pairs or alone, some with notebooks, some without. None of them expected a lecture. They didn't get one. Albrecht spoke when needed, gave corrections when they asked, but mostly he watched, observed the way they moved, the way they hesitated, the way their fingers betrayed their nerves, and when he saw something worth correcting, he did it quietly. No barking, no berating, just truth, delivered in the way truth should be, clean, quick, and without ego. One private approached awkwardly near lunchtime, holding a sealed lunch tray. He hesitated before placing it on the table beside Albrecht. "Didn't know what you liked, sir. Figured everyone likes chicken salad." Albrecht looked at the tray, then up at the boy. "I like Tuesdays," he said. The private blinked, uncertain, then smiled. He got it. It wasn't about the food. Later that afternoon, a new recruit arrived late to the drill briefing. As he ran toward formation, he paused when he noticed the seated old man under the canopy. He did a double take, then slowed, unsure if this was part of the exercise. One of the older recruits leaned over and whispered to him, just a few words. The new recruit nodded slowly, then adjusted his stance and stood straighter. The story had already begun passing itself along. By late afternoon, a pattern emerged. After drills, 2 or 3 medics would wander toward the tent. Not in groups, not in lines, just organically. One leaned on the fence and asked Albrecht about makeshift tourniquets. Another wanted to know what morphine looked like before it came in auto-injectors. Someone else just asked if he remembered the heat in the jungle. He did, and he described it the only way he could. It smelled like metal, and the rain never washed anything clean. At some point, a laminated sign appeared on the table near him. No one claimed to have made it. No one took credit. It read, simply, "Veteran presence in this area is part of active training. Listen, learn, respect." At the bottom, in small print, "Initiated under standing authority of Colonel Marcus Bain." He didn't mention it when he visited. Bain came by once a week now. Not in uniform, not for inspection, just to sit for a few minutes. Sometimes they didn't even speak. Just 2 old men sharing the silence that only comes after doing what others won't understand until it's too late. The soldier Albrecht had saved eventually returned to the base, still limping, still bruised, but walking. He approached the tent one afternoon with quiet steps, stood in front of Albrecht, and spoke only once. "Permission to shake your hand, sir." Albrecht stood slowly, reached out, took it. That handshake wasn't for him. It was for every hand he had ever held shut against a wound, for every pulse that had slowed beneath his fingers, for every life lost, and every life kept going just long enough to matter. The sun began to set. Shadows stretched across the gravel once again. A cool breeze drifted in from the hills, carrying the scent of sagebrush and diesel. The chair beside Albrecht's remained empty, but it was never unclaimed, because on that base, every Tuesday, a new tradition had been born, and respect had taken root, not through orders, but through action and memory, and one quiet man who never stopped carrying his bag. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.